everybody, Josh Sigurdson, a World Alternative Media here, and of course we're joined by author and economic analyst here at WAM, John Sneisen, and we have kind of gone into before the idea of China trying to create their new world order, the new world order. There was the old world order of Britain, and then the new world order of the US empire, and now we have the new world order as this replacement mechanism out of desperation as the world reserve currency collapses, and you have this massive power shift attempting to happen while the IMF is talking about putting their headquarters in Beijing. Now we got this massive issue of loan payments, which has been coming up a lot lately because China has claimed their first casualty. And as this article from Business Insider says, Zambia is reportedly in talks with China over acquiring its main power company after defaulting on loan repayment. Zambia could become Africa's first casualty in China's takeover after defaulting on loan repayment. And as it goes on to say, this is according to a report by Africa Confidential titled Bills, Bonds, and Even Bigger Debts, claiming that Zambia risks losing its sovereignty to China, which is bound to seize its national assets once the government defaults on loans. A major worry of the IMF and US is that China's BRI strategy is first to encourage indebtedness and then to take over strategic national assets when debtors default on repayments. The state electricity company ZESCO is already in talks about a takeover by a Chinese company, AC has learned. The long-term outcome could be effective Chinese ownership of the commanding heights of the economy and potentially the biggest loss of national sovereignty since independence, the report read. The report also indicates that a number of projects in Zambia are financed by China, even though the amount of debt has been piling over the years. And anyway, so I want to also go into one other article from The Sun, which says China colonizing smaller countries by lending them massive amounts of money they can never repay in a bid for world domination. And as you could see on the chart in this article, they show Montenegro is 865 million pounds. Djibouti is 1.1 billion pounds. Kyrgyzstan is 1.2 billion pounds. Papua New Guinea is 498 million pounds. Samoa is 181 million pounds. Pakistan, 41 billion pounds. Maldives, 968 million pounds. Laos, 838 million. And Fiji, 496 million. This is huge, folks, because you have to understand what is going on here. When we are seeing this massive push for a cashless society in China, this massive push for them to gather all this gold and be sitting on this massive pile of gold while other Western countries are selling off their gold like morons, and you have this massive shift to this massive superstructure that has been being built up, especially by the West, as like a ideal state of servitude among the world, throughout the world. When you have a society that is massive, there's so many people that don't care about other people. You see people getting hit by cars in the streets, children, and being left for hours. No one cares. Stupid, ridiculous laws like in any organized crime racket, but ultimately incredibly stupid. And then you have at the same time as that this uprising of the Trilateral Commission and the agenda going back to Kissinger going to China in the 1970s under Nixon without Nixon's permission, quote unquote, and like he needs it, and then talking with Mao Zedong, and then of course leading into Zbigniew Brzezinski establishing the Trilateral Commission under Jimmy Carter, and now creating this massive world power of China through this allied friendship of basically giving China the benefit in every single case. It was insane. We have to remember that China has always been a really big country. It was growing as Red China for many, many years. It was taking over Vietnam. It was taking over a big, like half of the world was red at one point, and it still kind of is, but it's more under a veil because they want to get away with it after all. But anyway, John, what do you think about all of this craziness? This is real colonization happening before our eyes.
Well, what I actually think it sounds very much like the international monetary fraud, the IMF. It's exactly the strategy that the IMF is using. And then, of course, Western media is out there, saying like, oh, bad China. Why are they doing this? Meanwhile, they just learned the technique from the IMF, where you go into, heavily corrupt countries, give the leaders a whole bunch of money, and then you, of course, know that they would never pay you back. They would just take the money as a payment for giving you their natural resources, their energy companies, their infrastructure, and so on, for nothing. And and that of course, what just recently happened with IMF in Greece. Nobody really talked about that. Well, there was some talk about that. Of course, the alternative media was talking about it, the takeover by the banksters and the IMF. But of course, we know everything that China, is have a little bit of a different approach than the United States have had. Yeah. Of course, the United States did use money from the Exchange Stabilization Fund to create the IMF. Yeah. We know that.
After FDR seized the gold in 1933 and used that to fund the ESF and later the IMF.
Yeah, exactly. So we know that, they have that strategy, the Americans, but the Americans also have another strategy that we kind of are starting to see now with China. We see the very early stages why, the U.S. have 800 plus, bases worldwide. Meanwhile, China just opened their first base, Josh, in Africa, in one of the countries you mentioned, Djibouti. So it's interesting, how
Though they have been working with in a fight against AFRICOM in Africa for many years over blood diamonds, oil, all that kind of stuff. But yeah, it's funny how money seems to be more powerful than a standing army when you control it and then you try and control the populace with it. It's funny how that works.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, Josh? And of course, I see World War III could break out over Africa. I talked to a very good friend of mine, my publisher, about this. And he's from Africa. He grew up in Nigeria. He's living in Canada now, of course, but he is oftenly down there. He was actually recently to Zambia, and he was saying how shocked they were that the populace didn't even know about this. What happened just suddenly came out of nowhere. But he did say that, you see a ton of Chinese people, in these African countries today, because they are the businessmen, the guys that run the state-owned enterprises for the Chinese communist empire, and they are trying to implement and take over and help them with all this infrastructure. Meanwhile, why they give a whole bunch of money for this infrastructure that suddenly the nation can't pay, as you saw with the power company in Zambia. Well, of course, what happens is that it's like, listen, you got to give me something here. What is your collateral? You always look at collateral when it comes to banking. When you borrow, when you lend money to somebody, of course, when you lend money to someone, the problem is the borrower doesn't have any collateral. Usually the bank prints that money out of thin air. So there's no collateral at the bank, but you have to come up with the collateral. And that's, these banksters are on it again. It's just different banksters, the Chinese banksters that was, the first ones to actually invent the fiat system we have today.
Yeah, back in 1024 AD, and it's failed every single time since. And just to finish it off, John, I have to mention how completely disgusted I am by the attacks on Africa, the entire continent of Africa, the Middle East. These are the most historic lands throughout all of humanity, throughout all human civilization. They have so much history to them. They are such incredible places. Africa is an incredible place. The Sahara is unbelievable. The history involved, the way the United States and many other countries, the United Nations, etc., destroyed Libya, how they're attempting to destroy places like Egypt, how they're destroying places. Government has been destroying all these places. Sudan, these are some of the most historic places on the planet, and then you have the Middle East on top of that, and it's really sad to watch it happen. It's just a perpetual destruction by governments, and the Middle East and Africa know a thing or two about perpetual destruction by government because it's been happening since the beginning of time. But what's happening, the way China has kind of locked their fingers in there, and this phony trade war, and I do believe it's rather phony because obviously, yeah, China had huge tariffs on U.S. production. U.S. kind of sat back, did nothing. Now the U.S. is doing something, but at the same time, it's really not seeming to have a major effect on China because China, they're just not producing certain things. Other companies in the United States are going out of business because of them not being able to get their exports at the right price from China. It's a mess.
Well, I do believe actually when you talk about the trade wars that it has some effect on China, because you got to remember China actually is a huge exporter to the United States. Yeah, so they're getting hit heavily by the tariffs that the United States is putting on. So their companies are going to suffer greatly from that. But now what you got to understand, when it comes to any, historical perspective on this, you always you go from currency war, which you currently have been having for, ever since 2008. between different countries where they devalue their currency against each other. But now you're seeing the trade wars are, starting to come up there, where you have, you subsidize your local economy, put heavy taxes on incoming products from that part of the economy that you want to protect. It's just another predecessor. So when you look at world history, when you put in a trade war, after, usually trade stops or stalls in the world economy, and then somebody is getting attacked in a hot war. Yeah. And that is the different dangers here that I see, especially with the world's resources, because what does China needs mostly, Josh, especially a lot of Asian countries that are huge growth countries, they need a lot of resources. Well, they have some at their places, but who is the greatest resource basket in the world, in my point of view, is Africa. And that's why you have United Nations and other organizations coming in with their climate change policies, trying to eliminate economic growth in these countries, and then for them to develop so they could continue to leech and suck them dry of their resources and steal from them.
And then depopulating the continent as well. It's just absolutely disgusting what the world government is doing, and it's all kind of morphing into the new world order. New. One of these days, like, if we don't learn, it's just going to be new world order.
It's a world order.
It's a world order, and it's a Chinese world order, and this fascio-commie state is completely in debt too. I mean, China has a massive level of debt.
They're actually at almost 300. In 2015, from G30 documents that I acquired, they show that they were in 290% total. That was government and everything, debt to GDP in China, and that's highest in the world at that time. Who knows where they're at now? They've been printing massive amounts of money, but they're trying to create the infrastructure to take over for the United States when the United States will fall, because there's no doubt about the US dollar currency is going to the garbage of history, where you believe that, like, these economists, I just laugh at them and they said, the United States dollar will never fail, it's the strongest there ever been, and then they fail to look at the world history where all these ideas have failed. And of course you have idiots like Krugman coming out and saying that, well, it's not going to happen in my lifetime, so I don't really care.
Yeah, and he also thought the internet was just a trend. Anyway, I mean, and we're seeing the centrally planned global cashless society system take off from there. If your money's in the bank, it's not yours, it's the bank's. And if your money's always going through the banks via digital transactions and legal tender laws, by fiat, if you will, it's never your money, it's always the bank's, and you are essentially enslaved to the banking system. And that's another major thing. While China pushes this, they're cracking down on attacking decentralized cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin and others that actually have some fundamental value and actually risk the banking system and the government. So there is a massive power shift happening. We are watching it take place. There are a few countries struggling to the top. We have India as well. We have Russia attempting to have a bigger gold export, hoard tons of gold, and they're making alliances with places like China as well, and places like India and others. And this is we'll just see how this ends, but let's just say that individuals need to be self-sustainable, independent, decentralize their lives, rule themselves. Get educated, folks. Learn about this kind of stuff, because if you aren't, you're going to get trampled underfoot. You need to understand money. If you control your money doesn't control you. And if you break free from this governmental system, the central banking system, both sides are organized crime, working hand in hand to indebt you and push you into debt servitude. If you can find your way in protecting your own purchasing power, ensuring your wealth, then you can go a long way and you can survive this calamity by far. But you need to understand the information and spread that information. Last word, John?
Well, last word, I actually have some exciting things that I'm working under the radar with right now. And what I'm doing currently is I'm meeting with a friend of mine from Africa, and we're looking at actually doing educational projects down in Africa, because Africa has been probably one of the worst continents in the world to have misused fiat currency there's so many hyperinflations down there, together with South America, of course. But yeah, it's just, you need to educate yourself, get your financial IQ, and understand these flawed systems that are getting shoved down your throat and enslaves you. So it's very important that you go out there, get yourself educated, and read books. You could take a look at my book, The End of Free freedom, how our monetary system enslaves us, which greatly, goes into detail how, this happens. And I talk about, in Africa, one of the biggest African countries, Zimbabwe, that, collapsed, and the lessons that have been learned there. So go and educate yourself. Don't let these elitists, destroy your country.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the end, we have to remember that these are all just organized crime rackets and they are all just sports teams, and we have to break free from it and not allow ourselves to become enslaved to it any further than we already have. Down with centralization, up with decentralization, and let's rule ourselves, folks. Thanks for going into this with us, John. And until next time, this is Josh Sigurdson and John Sneisen signing out from World Alternative Media. Find the truth,
Be the change.
Like what you see here, OM? Don't forget to check the links below. GoFundMe, Patreon. We can't do it without you. Any donation is very much appreciated, especially as we are so overwhelmingly demonetized by YouTube as they bring in the ADL to flag all of our content as hate speech. Also check our Bitcoin address in the description as well as on the screen for you to scan if you please. And also check us out at Steemit at Josh Sigurdson, the future of social media, where you get paid in the upvote of your post in cryptocurrency, Steem that is. So don't forget to check us out there and find us at Anarchapulco 2019. I know it's early, but this is such an exciting event coming up with Ron Paul, Judge Napolitano, David Icke, Larkin Rose, Jeff Berwick, all the usual characters, and it's going to be amazing. So we hope to see you there. Make sure to check the link for Anarchapulco below and use promo code WHAM to save as much as 15% on your tickets. We hope to see you there. But until next time, this is Josh Sigurdson signing out from World Alternative Media. Find the truth, be the change.
I'm sure you have already changed people's minds in your young age because you're involved, and I like that.